I would certainly want to emphasize and embrace this idea, not because I think that Jews should be shouting anti-Semitism wherever we go. I think that Jews should stand up against bigotry in all its forms, and it should be central to our identity. Should be central to Tikkun Olam, the idea of repairing the world. What is more broken than intolerance and hatred?
We gather tonight as the Jewish community is still reeling from the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre, the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. I was in Pittsburgh yesterday for a memorial service in support of the Jewish community there, attended by JCC and Federation leaders from around the country. We made a collective Shiva call to that community. And that assault came at a time when there appears to be such a significant rise in hate-related speech and crimes across the country. We bore witness, we heard, and we saw how much damage hate can do. On our panel this evening, we are truly honored to be joined by two of the most prominent Jewish journalists in this country. Both have been reporting on these issues throughout this season and for many, many months and years.
Please welcome Jonathan Weisman. Mr. Weisman is the deputy Washington editor of the New York Times, handling the paper's coverage of Congress and broader political coverage. A target of the alt-right's attacks, he was one of dozens of Jewish journalists attacked on social media by neo-Nazis during the 2016 campaign, barraging him with anti-Semitic insults and threats. Mr. Weisman is the author of Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump, where he warns about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. We also welcome Jane Eisner. Ms. Eisner is the editor-in-chief of the U.S. Jewish national weekly newspaper, The Forward. During her leadership as the first woman to hold the position, readership has grown significantly, and the newspaper has won numerous regional and national awards for its original journalism. Before joining The Forward, Ms. Eisner was a columnist and editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Our moderator tonight is Barbara Kellerman. Ms. Kellerman is the James McGregor Burns Lecturer in Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She is the founding executive director of the school's Center for Public Leadership, and from 2003 to 2006, she served as the center's research director. Ms. Kellerman has held professorships at various higher education institutions, including Fordham, Tufts, and at both Dartmouth and the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth.
And lastly, it is important to note that this conversation, like many of the topics that we cover in this Hot Button series, is about the impact of current issues on the community and is not about any particular candidate or election. The JCC Greater Boston does not endorse or oppose candidates for public office or political parties. I ask you this evening, please be respectful of all the thoughts and the opinions that are shared by our panelists. This is not a Yankees-Red Sox game. No booing, no cheering, no applauding different ideas, please.
Well, first of all, thank you all for hosting us. Thank you to my colleagues in advance of this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. It is going to be civil, but it's also going to be interesting and intriguing, and we trust enlightening. I'm going to make some opening comments, very brief, and then I will turn it over to our two main panelists. They will respond to some questions of mine, but they will also talk to each other. We anticipate this will be a lively conversation, And then, as was just said, at around 8:30, we will turn it to you for some questions. So let me first frame this. I'm a leadership person. I write a lot of books about leadership. But I'm going to not emphasize the leader tonight. Obviously, the President of the United States, one of the obvious leaders, but rather talk very briefly about context. Let me make just 3 contextual remarks. First of all, this event, to say the obvious, at least to some of us, was planned before the deadliest attack on Jews in America, in American history, obviously in Pittsburgh. I will have a little bit more to say about that in a moment. Second of all, in the last week, we have had a major political event in this country, that is the midterm elections. Let me make a few comments about those, and perhaps they will in some way impact on the remarks that we hear later. Number one, it has turned out, a week subsequent to Election Day, that there has been something of a blue wave. I do not wish to exaggerate it, but I wish merely to point it out. Number two, the turnout was extremely high for a midterm election. It is impossible to underestimate the importance of the high level of interest of the American people in our political culture and events of the current moment. And I want that to be sort of the backdrop of this conversation. There are obviously profound implications for President Donald Trump, both of the midterm elections and also of the larger political atmosphere, not least of which the Mueller investigations. However, we will not focus, as the point has already been made, he is the, if you will, 800-pound gorilla in the room, but we will not focus our comments particularly on him. The third comment I want to make is that the FBI, and some of you will have read this just yesterday, released some new statistics on the rise of hate crimes, but particularly anti-Semitism. In 2017, these are the FBI figures, there were 37%, a not inconsequential increase, more anti-Semitic crimes reported to the FBI than were the case 1 year earlier in 2016. And in New York City, the American city most closely associated with giving Jews a home, this year anti-Semitic incidents have constituted half of all hate crimes. Put another way, there have been 4 times as many crimes motivated by bias against Jews this year as were motivated by bias against blacks. I have some further comments to make about Pittsburgh, but I don't want to dwell on that event either. So I will simply close by pointing out again what I said earlier. The title of tonight's event is Being Jewish in Trump's America. The subtitle of Jonathan's book, which we're here to discuss, as well as to honor and celebrate, is Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump. So we cannot avoid the man. We will not, however, dwell. So with that, I am going to turn my first question, to the extent that we can restrain ourselves. I realize this may be an irresistible temptation. Let's see how well we do with it. In any case, Jonathan, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to start with rather a personal question, but one that you raise very prominently in your book. The question is, I read the book as something of, there's a German word called Bildungsroman, which is really a coming-of-age book. This is not exactly a coming-of-age story because you were fully adult when you had your moral or whatever it is awakening. So my question to you is, could you say a little bit more about the better part of your life as a, if we may use the term, secular Jew, but then this person, not everyone, I'm sure 99% of you have read Jonathan's book, but not 100%. So let him say a little bit about what triggered and inspired this book to begin with.
Well, let me just say that I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, in a moderately Jewish household, I'd say. I went to the city's really most reformed synagogue. We had I thought it was normal that we had an electric arc and that the the door would come down and light shot out of it. We actually had a Christian choir behind the curtains to make it sound all the more angelic. I was bar mitzvahed, I was confirmed, I was not encumbered by a Haftorah portion, so it was easier back then. I went off to college in Northwestern in Chicago. I just wasn't that Jewish identified. My only real brush with Hillel was an argument my senior year over the Canton solution versus the two-state solution, but I think that Jews argue over Israel way too much, so let's not get into that. Anyway, I kind of, I had two daughters. One of them is a militant atheist. The other one insisted on a Jewish education and got one, but I would put that to her, not to me. And the fact of the matter is, I would say that I was pretty typical of my generation until I wasn't. And that was when, during the 2016 campaign, as I often do, there was just a column in the Washington Post by Robert Kagan, a Republican and conservative Jewish scholar at the Brookings Institution, called "This is How Fascism Comes to America." I put a little piece of it on, into Twitter and sent it out into the world, and I got a little note back from somebody called Cybertrump, and all it said was, "Hello, Weisman." But Weisman was in three parentheses. Now, I didn't know what that meant, but I intuited that I have a Jewish-sounding name, and this must have something to do with that. And I sent him a note back asking Cybertrump, care to explain? And he sent me a note that said, "What ho, the vaunted Ashkenazi intelligence? It's a dog whistle, fool. I'm belling the cat for my fellow Goyim." And then this absolute onslaught of anti-Semitic hate. I mean, and I can't explain how ugly it was, imagery of my head photoshopped over a Holocaust victim about to get his head blown off by a Nazi, me in a gas chamber, these things, and it went on and on and on. And I was so unbelievably taken aback because, I learned about anti-Semitism as a kid as something that was in the past. And the imagery and just the virulence of it really stunned me. And it got me, I came to that realization that you can run from your Judaism, but your Judaism will always find you.
So I'm going to just piggyback one more question, Jonathan. Given this awakening, this very well encapsulated in your last line, would you now raise your children differently than you were raised?
I would raise my children differently than I raised them.
And I mean in this regard. We're not talking blanket here. We're talking specifically this regard.
I mean, I think that I think that, well, let me just explain this. I went to, my synagogue when I grew up is called the Temple. Nobody actually calls it its full name. It's just called the Temple. And my parents joined it. They moved from New York when I was 2. And they joined it because the Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, was very involved in the civil rights movement. It was a very woke temple. But only when I was researching this book did I find out that actually the most famous Jew in Atlanta history had been a congregant, and that was Leo Frank. I did not know. Nobody taught me. I was bar mitzvahed, I was confirmed. Nobody taught me that Leo Frank had been a congregant at my synagogue when he was hauled out of the Milledgeville State Prison and lynched. So I think that
Jonathan, give the year.
That was in 1908? I think 1908.
A little later.
Back then.
Yeah.
early in the 20th century.
Right. Yeah. But what struck me is that we are as a Jewish community, we tend to be very shy about talking about anti-Semitism or bigotry in general. I think that there is a diffidence in our conversation. And I think I would certainly want to emphasize and embrace this idea, not because I think that Jews should be shouting anti-Semitism wherever we go. I think that Jews should stand up against bigotry. in all its forms, and it should be central to our identity. Should be central to tikkun olam, the idea of repairing the world. What is more broken than intolerance and hatred?
Jane, I have a question for you, but I first want to ask if you want to respond to anything that Jonathan said.
Well, I think Jews have been standing up for bigotry for a really long time. I mean, I do agree that something has shifted in the last couple of years. And I, too, there must have been a run on those images of putting your head on top of a concentration camp victim with the gun pointed at your head, because that happened to me as well. It's, we can joke about it, but I got to tell you, when you sit there at your computer and you open this random email and that image pops up, you know, you can't help but be deeply, deeply affected. And I've been a journalist for a long time, and in the non-Jewish media and the Jewish media, and certainly had lots of criticism from left, right, and center. But I think what's been different, I mean, demonstrably different in the last couple of years, is the use of Holocaust imagery to target journalists. And that really has been stunning and troubling. But I think to the point that you made at the end there, I do think that there have been amazing Jewish organizations, Jewish leaders, and individuals who have been fighting bigotry for a long time. And in fact, one could argue that what happened with Pittsburgh is that we realize, oh, now we're among those targeted minorities as well.
So we've had already 2 references to history, your reference to Leo Frank, and Jane, you twice in your brief comments said in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. So I want to nail you a little bit on that. So let me ask you 2 questions. One is, can you set this conversation in a larger and longer historical, for the moment, just American context? And 2 is to refer to your last couple of years. If this were about the age of Obama as opposed to the age of Trump, would the conversation have been different? Are you, in fact, when you casually throw out the phrase last couple of years, since you may use the phrase twice, do you mean that quite literally, like the last 2 years? Are you sensing a change even in the last 2 years? Indeed, some of these figures that we're getting suggest some of that, but you're the expert, so let me ask you about a historical perspective, a bit long-term, but also in the last couple of years.
Okay, it's a tall order. I think that we have to remember that we have been a minority in this country since before its independence. And I think that while the Pittsburgh massacre was the most violent expression of anti-Semitism, there certainly has been pervasive anti-Semitism all along. You know, whether it was quotas that kept Jews out of colleges and universities, whether it was the fact that social clubs, law firms, all sorts of private and public institutions wanted to limit the number of Jews that were taking part. All the social pressure to change your name, get your nose fixed, look a different way and fit in. And so I think we've got to take the longer view and recognize that this is part of who we are in America. That said, most Jews here are white, and I think have, myself included, been privileged because of that. So yes, we've suffered discrimination, but we've also, especially in the last 50 years, been really, really welcomed into our society. And until recently, when we've been so concerned about anti-Semitism, the biggest thing we were worried about was assimilation and intermarriage. And intermarriage is in part because we've been so accepted. I mean, remember, what did the former Secretary of State and the former Vice President have in common? Jewish sons-in-law. I mean, everybody loves us and they want to marry us. And that's part of what's happened as well. So I think it's been a real mixture, and yes, in the last couple of years, I think a real awakening. You know, the attacks on journalists, the attacks on Jews. As a Jewish journalist, I get it both ways. This is nothing new in that it's happened before. What's new, I think, is the intensity. As I mentioned, the use of Holocaust imagery. This has coincided with the rise of social media. Your book details that so well, Jonathan. I mean, we can't take this out of the larger context. You know, it was one thing when somebody would write you a letter or even write you an email. It's another thing when they go after you on Twitter. And so we have to recognize that it's not just the political situation, it's also the technology that has changed the way we communicate with each other, and the way that a single slur can be amplified in such a fashion.
I'd like to talk a little bit, just real quickly, give one anecdote about that, because this is the power of the internet as a tool for spreading an ideology and hate is extremely almost deceptive. Look, at one point, for a long time, the neo-Nazis and the Klan and such, they communicated with each other in their own little worlds. They had newsletters. They might even have had a website. But you know, the only people who went to go see to the Daily Stormer or to Stormfront were neo-Nazis and Klansmen. But now you are seeing that they understand that the way to spread an ideology is to get out of those ghettos and move into where everybody is going to see you. And I'll tell you one story, because my daughter showed me this, because I wouldn't have known this. Has anyone heard of a guy named PewDiePie? Okay, I didn't think you did. There's a guy, he's a Swedish YouTuber named PewDiePie, and people of most generations will have never heard of him, but if you're 12 years old, you've heard of him. And my daughter showed me this video of PewDiePie, who's very silly, and he's kind of dancing around, and he was talking about how he had gone on this website called Fiverr, in which for $5 you can hire somebody to do anything. And he went on and he hired these two guys in India to do some secret mission. And in the video, which was uploaded and seen by, I mean, tens of millions of people around the world, he's getting all excited. He said, "Oh, you think, are these guys going to really do what I say?" And they uploads this video, and you see these two guys in India being very silly and dancing around, and PewDiePie's getting all excited. And then they unveil a banner, these two guys in India, and the banner says, "Death to all Jews." Now, PewDiePie thought that was going to be funny. And then when he saw it, he was so embarrassed, he feigned, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe they actually did this. Oh, I'm so sorry." But for millions, literally millions of young boys generally, that was the first time they saw the phrase, "Death to all Jews." And this has become a tool to spread hate like we've never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to add one additional, this is a supplement to what you both just said, not a replacement for. In addition to the technology and all the implications that you both alluded to, I also think there's a changing culture. I sometimes call it the Oprahization of American culture, where our capacity to let it all hang out has really, and our willingness to let it all hang out has really changed the nature of the dialogue. So the combination of the changing culture and this venting of everything, this expressing of everything, this revealing of everything in combination with the internet, to me, has really changed the nature of the collective discourse.
Well, it's also about political discourse in a very intentional way. When the president says, I hate political correctness. I'm not going to go for this political correctness. A certain element of this country sees political correctness as what we defined as decency. No, we don't have to censor ourselves. We can say exactly what we mean. And if what exactly we mean is that we hate Jews or we hate blacks or these immigrants are taking our jobs, hey, I'm not going to self-censor because that's political correctness. This is an intentionality, the removal of the guardrails on our society.
I agree, but I think there's also something else. I think there's been a change in our own expectations. I mean, you know,
expectations of
acceptance in this society. You know, I've always felt that I've never been stopped to do anything as a Jew. It's never held me back. And that's for the most part true, even if I get some nasty emails. And that was not true for my father, and it certainly wasn't true for my grandfather, and it wasn't true for many other generations. And that's a good thing. It is a good thing. We should have our rightful place in this society, but that is also very threatening. And I think that's where we're getting the pushback.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to talk about like the more contemporary history of all of this, first of all, you have to go back 10 years. The alt-right, the term alt-right was alternative right. It was actually a reaction to the lighter Bush years, where a certain element of the right wing was unhappy with foreign adventurism, the collapse of the election of the economic system. The alt-right actually emerged in about like 2007, 2008. So we're not talking about something that happened because of Donald Trump. What happened though was there was a convergence of circumstances. The alt-right starts developing as a nationalist, white nationalist, racist movement in the far right. Then this very strange thing called Gamergate happened. And Gamergate was around 2011, 2012. A group of young lads on a website called 4chan, I don't know if you guys have ever trolled around 4chan, decided that a small group of women video game designers, who are feminist women video gamers, decided they needed to be destroyed. And they swarmed these women video gamers. One of them lives in Boston, Brianna Wu. And they tried to destroy her by doxing them, putting their social security numbers and credit cards and banking account numbers online. They tried to destroy their reputation. They absolutely tried to run these women into the ground. And it was the people the Nazis on the Daily Stormer and other places that saw what happened, what they did to these video game designers, and said, "Whoa, we've been doing this all wrong. We can use the internet not just to organize or not just to communicate with each other. We can weaponize it and use it to destroy people." And that was when the alt-right actually became a threat, a real threat. And then, we had this sense for so long, basically since the 1950s, 1960s, that the United States was on a not necessarily steady, but basic upward trajectory toward a more inclusive, open, welcoming society. And we moved that way through the Obama years. And I think that what has changed really is that sudden sense now that maybe that trajectory was wrong.
Okay.
Maybe it was not inevitable.
So I am now going to pull you back to your own words in your own book. You wrote, quoting you, that for all the bile, the threat of violence against Jews has not materialized into actual violence. Now, of course, you wrote that a few months ago, obviously. The book came out in May, so you may have written it a year, whenever. Now that Pittsburgh has happened, how would you amend that general sentiment? Would you add something to it? Was it all wrong? It wasn't wrong up to that point, at least not in recent American history. Now, in other words, that Pittsburgh has happened, how would you change some of your book, particularly that kind of sentiment?
Well, in the context was that violence was being meted upon other other groups,
Correct.
like immigrant groups, like
Right.
Muslim Americans,
Right.
And that it hadn't reached the Jewish community. But I think that the context was that I thought that it was inevitable. That you have right now in the United States a very violent gun culture, and you have at the same time this violent ideology that's brewing under the surface. And it was almost inevitable that they would eventually connect. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the mass shooting in Pittsburgh and the mass shooting in Charleston were exactly that, the combination of a violent gun culture and now an actual ideology and a mission. Mr. Bowers and Mr. Roof were basically just two sides of the same coin. So when I wrote that, I wasn't thinking that we were somehow immune. I just thought it hadn't happened yet.
Jane?
Well, I think that we also have to remember that even though we have Pittsburgh so fresh in our minds, that at least according to the FBI statistics that just came out this week, there has been a terrible increase in hate crime. But it's mostly been vandalism, not violence, against Jews. And I'm not excusing it. I mean, you know, building a block from my home on the Upper West Side of New York was defaced with swastikas last year, and it's pretty horrifying to walk by that. But there is a difference between vandalizing a building and taking someone's life. And, you know, I know this is part of the work that you did in your book as well, Jonathan, and I have said for a long time, and I still believe it, that what's happening to the Jewish community in the last couple of years needs to be put into perspective, and our new vulnerability needs to awaken our compassion. We now understand what it's like to be a targeted minority that has been not only subject to vandalism, but also real deadly violence. And as horrible as it's been, many, many people have it worse. Just think about the fact that the police rushed into Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. There are many people in the African American community who wouldn't trust the police to rush in to help them. So we need to use this incredible privilege that we have, along with the vulnerability that we're now experiencing, to try to make a more just society.
I'm going to stay with you for a minute, and I'm going to switch gears.
Sure.
I'm going to quote a line from his book, but I'm going to ask you about it, Jane. Mm-hmm. The line is, anti-Semitism and the existence of Israel are hardly disconnected. I wonder if you would be willing to comment on the role of Israel in a point that Jonathan makes a lot of, as we both know, on the role of Israel in this particular conversation, that is the conversation about anti-Semitism in America. If you want to add in the age of Trump, it's fine with me.
I think that there's no doubt that some criticism of Israel, some activities against Israel, goes beyond a disagreement with a policy or a government or a person, and really goes to a disagreement over the right of Jews to have their own state. And in my view, it does bleed into anti-Semitism. You know, we really don't know. I mean, my staff is trying to look into this right now. We don't know how much of that increase in hate crimes against Jews in 2017 that the FBI documented is coming from the right, from the alt-right or other places, or coming from the left, the far left. And I think both are very, very worrying. What we've seen recently, and certainly I think the specific Holocaust-related harassment that we have seen, in my experience, is definitely coming from the right. But that's not to say that there aren't serious threats against Jews that are related to Israel. That's not what happened in Pittsburgh. That's not what motivated him. But we don't know if it might not motivate someone else.
Jonathan, since Israel plays a fairly large role in your book. Would you like to say a few words, either about what Jane said or just what you said in the book, and for people who...
Well, I talk about Israel in several different contexts in the book. One of them being that I think that American Jews have become almost obsessive about Israel. And we argue, we have J Street, we have AIPAC. We have the New Israel Fund, we have the American Jewish Committee. We sit and we argue and we argue and we argue and we argue over Israel. I think there's a reason that as the alt-right began building steam after, in the latter Bush years in 2007, 2008, through the Obama years, that we didn't notice them, is because American Jews spend way too much time thinking about the Jewish state and not looking around and seeing what's happening in our own country. That was one context that I talked about Israel. The other context is this. I mean, is the anti-Semitism of the left versus the right. Now, I will say this. I have a stepdaughter at Barnard. I have a daughter at Vassar. I see how the Palestinian rights movement on campuses can certainly make Jewish students feel uncomfortable and sometimes actually downright unwelcome on their own campuses. I also know that a lot of young Jews are also very off-put right now by the Israeli government. And I will say this to the young people that are here, there are some, I think that young American Jews need to find a way to identify with their Judaism, to embrace their Judaism without being told that being Jewish is about embracing the government of Israel. And because if you go to college, you know, kids who are who are coming of age right now, who are going to college, 19, 20 years old, they don't know a Labor Party and a Likud Party. They don't they don't know of a dynamic democracy in Israel. They can't remember the Camp David Accords. They can't remember the Oslo Accords. All they know is one thing, and they know Bibi Netanyahu. And I will tell you right now, because I see it through the eyes of my own children, if being a Jew means embracing Israel in Israeli policies, what we're going to do is lose a generation of young Jews. They have to be, our generation, needs to be tolerant of them as they explore what it means for them to have a Jewish identity. And that doesn't always mean loving the government in Jerusalem. So I'll just put that out.
I can't resist asking you. I mean, I was not going to, Jane, but I can't.
Well, you know, I think that many, many Jews have cared very deeply about America and, yes, care deeply about Israel. In my view, you cannot be a modern Jew today and not be engaged in some way with Israel as a state, as a culture, because of the food, because you like the movies, or because you are supportive of the settlements or against the occupation or whatever it is. So I don't think we talk too much about it. I think sometimes our conversations have been stilted. I do agree that I think we have to be much more tolerant of many, many different views and not be so quick to say, you know, you don't belong in this proverbial tent or you don't belong in it either. And I think we are witnessing a generation that for whom, you know, Israel is not, as it was when I was a little girl, you know, this very, very fragile democracy surrounded by enemies and nearly wiped off the map in 1967. Rather, younger people today see Israel as what it is, this extraordinary economy, this vibrant culture, this huge military, and for some of them, you know, a country that has ruled over another people for half a century. And that's a problem. So I think we have to recognize that younger people especially are going to, through their own lived experience, in the same way that Israel to me was different than Israel to my parents. But I don't think it's a matter of whether or not we talk about it too much or too little. I think we need to talk about it as much as we need to, but we must do it in a much broader and more tolerant way. But I also think that, we as American Jews have a really, really proud history of being very involved in politics and social movements and civil rights, and that has not abated at all, at all.
I can't resist trying to pit the two of you against each other.
Well, okay,
so let me again turn it to you, Jonathan, to see if you want to respond.
When my book came out, Jane reviewed it. It wasn't a particularly kind review, and one paragraph. But I will say that when my book came out, I knew that there would be some conservative American Jews who didn't like it because they would say that I was picking on the right, or somehow that pointing out bigotry in the age of Trump was to call Donald Trump a bigot. I knew I would get that. Okay, I knew that my very straight-on criticism of the big mainline Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Committee, which I still believe is way too diffident, way too careful on some of these political issues. I knew that they would respond negatively, and they did. Jane's criticism on that I was not giving enough credit to other Jewish organizations, especially women, that was just something I hadn't anticipated. And I respect it. It was fine. And I have become very sensitized to it, because certainly wherever I go, I say, wait, but we have this little organization over here that's doing all these wonderful things, or we have my rabbi is teaming up with this imam in our local mosque, and they're doing wonderful things, and I think that they are doing wonderful things. I would just say that if the big glass and steel edifices in New York and Washington were as involved in the rise of intolerance in our country as they are in, say, maintaining support for Israel, we would know it. And I don't think we do know it. I still feel that there is a reluctance, kind of a hand-wringing, what about our 501c3 status, that I see in the Jewish community that I don't see, say, in the evangelical Christian community. They don't seem very worried about their 501c3 status. And yet somehow we are to keep our voices down in the public square, and I don't think that our voices should be so muffled.
And I think we just have to be much more willing and studious and curious and energetic to listen to the voices that are there, because they are. Those glass and steel edifices, as you say, are, I hate to say this, but less and less relevant. And not just to young Jews, to many, many Jews. And we're seeing the rise of just extraordinary leadership in social justice activism. Just look what happened in Pittsburgh. So some of you may know the organization Bend the Arc. Very, very active social justice lefty organization. National, local, there are local chapters. President Trump announced on the Monday after the massacre that he was going to visit Pittsburgh on Tuesday. And whether or not you think that was a good idea, I think the president has every right to visit a bereaved community. Nonetheless, there were many people in Pittsburgh who did not think that that was, if not, that he wasn't either welcome or he wasn't welcome then, when the funerals were just starting and it wasn't the right time. So within a day's time, these local activists, and they were local activists, there were one or two people who came in from New York, I know who they are, but believe me, these were local people, pulled together an extraordinary protest. Just extraordinary. It was peaceful, it was creative, it was so Jewish. All the songs that they sang were Jewish songs. And these were not things that they just decided that Monday evening. These were songs that these same activists had sung at rallies to protect immigrant rights, at rallies to protest police violence and other things. So it was natural for them to do it. And then they came up with this fantastic ritual. They said, we need to do something. What should it be? And I hope some or all of you saw this. They decided to kind of create their own kriya. You know, when we are in mourning, when we've lost a loved one, our clothing is torn. We rent our garment, and the tradition is that you wear that rent garment for the week of Shiva. Certainly I did this when my parents died. And they adapted that. So they got these little pieces of ribbon and construction paper. They were like this big, and they handed out thousands of them to the people who came to the protest. And these were not all Jews, and they just said, hold on to this. Well, and at some point when they gathered, then they symbolically ripped the paper, the ribbon, and said the prayers. And there are just amazing photographs of them standing there doing this. I sadly was not there. I was watching this live on CNN. On CNN. I mean, this is a private Jewish ritual that suddenly was transformed into a public statement that for all the world to see. And I just find this to be one of many remarkable examples of the way Jews were taking ritual and values and experiences and adapting them to a political statement or a time. Think of the front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on that Friday. David Schwidman, the executive editor, not very much of a religious Jew at all. I mean, I spoke to him the day after, and he just knew, as he said, when words fail you, you have to do something else. So he puts the Kaddish, the first four words in Hebrew, Aramaic, however you want to say it, of the Kaddish on the whole front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I mean, you don't do that unless you feel like your language can reach a broader audience. And I find this all just unbelievably heartening. I'm not saying it's, you know, the silver lining of a massacre, because that's ridiculous. There can't be a silver lining to a massacre. But I do think it's a public expression of things that have been going on for years now. And I think that that's the antidote to sort of saying, well, Jews don't care about these things. I think they have. We just haven't been paying attention.
So I have one final question for both of you, but before I ask that and we turn to you, I want to be sure that everybody who has a question has written it on a card and that the cards have been turned in so we can start to move to all of you guys. So while we're having this last question, if you can make sure to hand in your cards, and if the card gatherers can get them up here to me, that would be great, because I do want to very much involve, all of us want very much to involve all of you. So my final question is my own personal question. And it's my own personal question because of who I am. I am the daughter of a woman who was born in Düsseldorf, Germany, and a man who was born in Vienna, Austria. And perhaps because of that European backdrop, I have two questions, and they're actually related. One is, as you look back, do you see what's been going on in Europe over the last 10 years as something of a canary in the coal mine with regard to anti-Semitism in this country? And the second is a more personal question, not about me, but about a single individual. Because I, anyway, have been stunned, and I have to say horrified, at the way the name of George Soros has been used to kind of symbolize the way it used to be done and what we thought were days gone by, this whole thing of the other, the Jew, the rich guy, the outsider, the owner of the caravan, the funder of this, the funder of that. So if you could bundle the two questions, one about anti-Semitism in Europe as a precursor, maybe or maybe not, and the other of the personalization of this in the embodiment of this single individual, ironically, of course, a Hungarian Jew who got out, was hidden and then got out. In any sequence, are we going to do?
Why don't you go?
Go, Jane, go.
I think the anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Europe is akin to some things here, but also very different. Remember that Europe was the home of the Holocaust. I mean, the cultures there are so different. And even in countries that were not directly part of the Shoah, I mean, my mother was born and raised in England. I'm half English. And thank God Great Britain was spared the Holocaust, but there still is so much more embedded anti-Semitism in England in a way that's just very, very different here. You know, America was created differently. I mean, we are just not the same. I think that some of the anti-Semitism in Europe, especially in France, is much more related to the Israeli-Palestinian debate, much more related to Muslim terrorism than we see here. Here, it's not anywhere near as much. So I think that I don't know that it's a canary in a coal mine. I think that what we have to recognize is that there's some ways in which the soil with which this is growing is similar, but it is only partially similar. And I think that that's what's happening now, too, especially post-Pittsburgh, is that we're realizing that we have a homegrown problem, that it's not what's going on in Europe. This is, you know, not the Labour Party in the UK. It's not France. It's not Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's not necessarily the struggle between Israeli and Palestinians and Jews and Muslims in the Middle East. It's a different kind of anti-Semitism, fueled right now much more by the alt-right, but not only, and it's ours to deal with. And on Soros, I think it is just so obvious that it's kind of crazy. It's so crude. It is so crudely a stereotype, you know, the rich Jew who manipulates everything. And what I do find frightening are, let's be honest, the political leaders who have used that stereotype. You know, everyone from Viktor Orban to Donald Trump to, I hate to say it, Benjamin Netanyahu. You know, I think that he has become the embodiment of all of these very stereotypical, prejudicial Jewish images. It's unwarranted, it's unfair, and that part is frightening.
Thanks, Jane.
Well, I'll start with the Soros issue first. I mean, George Soros as the Jewish boogeyman has been around for quite some time. What distinguishes this moment from what I've seen about George Soros for so long is, first of all, George Soros is just the latest incarnation. The Rothschilds were before the Soroses.
Well,
so
that's precisely my point.
So there's all.
Right.
I mean, you know, in the pantheon of white nationalism, you must understand that white nationalists believe that there is something ongoing right now called the white genocide, and that white people are being slaughtered, or being watered down, or being replaced. But remember, the white nationalists also see brown-skinned and black-skinned people as inferior to them. They're an inferior race. So they think, well, wait a minute. How could there be a genocide underway? How could we be losing this struggle to these inferior people, these Latinos and Muslims and black people? Something must be wrong. And then they say, because there is actually a superior race, the Ashkenazi Jew. Remember when I said that first message from Cybertrump said, "What ho the vaunted Ashkenazi intelligence." They believe that the Ashkenazi Jew is in fact the most brilliant species of human beings in the world, except that we are nefarious. We are deeply evil. So the Ashkenazi Jew, i.e. George Soros, or the Rothschilds, or whoever, are the puppet masters that are orchestrating the white genocide. Now, all of that sounds farcical to you, except that, remember, Donald Trump just talked about George Soros as orchestrating the caravan. Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, went on national television to say that George Soros was paying paid provocateurs to protest Brett Kavanaugh. Kevin McCarthy, now the minority leader, was then the majority leader in the House, said that George Soros and Mike Bloomberg were buying this election. The Soros mythology is now mainstream. So that is what's disturbing. And to talk about Europe, I mean, I agree completely with Jane that there is that Europeans are different from Americans. But there is a global movement right now of intolerant authoritarian nationalism. And it's in Hungary, it's in Poland, but it's in Italy, it's now in Brazil, it's in the Philippines, it's in Washington, and frankly, you know, the Netanyahu government is actually seen as something of the godfather of ethno-nationalism in that realm. So I think that there is, yes, there are differences, but there are also similarities. And we have to recognize that right now, intolerant authoritarian nationalism is a global movement. It is not just an American problem.
And, you know, just to add one more thing about Soros, which I find really fascinating, is that, you know, I think we like to sort of find equivalencies, right? Well, there's anti-Semitism on the right, and there's also on the left. And the right, you know, stereotypes Jews, but so does the left. But Soros and a little bit Bloomberg are the ones who, as you rightly pointed out, are the ones who are stereotyped as being controlling the election. Only who is the biggest funder of the midterms?
Sheldon Adelson.
Sheldon Adelson.
He's the good Jew.
That's right. And you never see him in this situation. And he was hanging out with President Trump on election night. I mean, he just got his wife a Medal of Honor. I mean, he has way, way, way more power right now than any of these other people who are targeted in such a nefarious way. So sometimes there isn't an equivalency.
Okay, it's your turn, guys, and I'm going to do the best I can with your handwriting. Question, this is not just a question, it's got a title. Question title, political climate change? Clever, very clever. Background, the very start of cataclysmic seismic shifts often passes under the radar. Question to the two of you. Do you think the deliberate use of hate encouraging rhetoric by elected leaders poses a serious threat of political climate change that could drown and or burn down civil society in America, or is it just a mild concern that we can handle readily? Either one of you or both.
Well, I'll just real quickly take a stab at it. We're kind of in this moment, you know, of history where we don't know where we're going. Like, we don't know if we are at the end of the advancement toward a more civil, more tolerant society, and we are now going into a nosedive, or if this is just this blip and we'll recover and we'll resume our trajectory toward tolerance and pluralism. So we don't know. It's hard to answer that question because it's hard to answer history when you're in the middle of it.
You're about to take a stab at it.
Well, but
anyway.
I will just say that incivility in politics and their society is a very serious issue, and I would not be I would not dismiss it as, well, it'll pass. It's hard for me to exactly see how exactly it passes.
I agree. I don't think we know. I think just 2 fresh points. We have seen so many of the norms of civil and political discourse being broken or disregarded in the last few years, and that concerns me. And I think the other thing related to that is whether or not our democratic institutions can withstand this pressure. I've always believed that they would. You know, the time in my career when I wasn't in a newsroom, I worked at the National Constitution in Philadelphia. I sort of hung out with the framers there. I'm a bit of a constitutional nerd, and I've taught American government in college, and I think our institutions are magnificent. But they're under a lot of stress right now, and the rhetoric is connected to that. And how much the rhetoric undermines the institutions will really be a test of whether or not this is a reaction to a march towards tolerance or, as you said, a nosedive into something worse.
So this question actually piggybacks rather nicely on the first one, so why don't I give it to you both now? And it also piggybacks on my opening framing comment. What do you think the input of the midterm elections will be on the rise of anti-Semitism in the US? And of course, you can answer, there will be no impact, but whatever.
I mean, I tend to think that it will have probably very little impact because what the midterms showed was how divided our country is in these geographic terms. I mean, I think that the areas of the country that have underscored the rise of Trumpism didn't really show that they were shaken. But the suburbs and the urban areas showed how far they have reacted to it. So there's this diffusion, and now with divided government, I think that you'll only underscore the frustrations and the angers already out there. If a Democratic House pursues Donald Trump or impeaches Donald Trump, but the Republican Senate digs in its heels, I mean, everybody's got somebody to root for and to root against, and that might have that might only exacerbate the situation. But again, I don't know.
I don't know that we can predict either. We did see a lot of Jews running, a lot of Jews winning. There are now 2 Jewish governors, and there hadn't been that for a while. But we also are seeing this consolidation where 79 to 80% of those who voted were told, according to exit polls, of the Jews who voted Democratic. And that while Jews have largely been Democratic since about the 1920s and 30s, it's much, much more lopsided now. And particularly what we don't have is that kind of moderate Republican. The moderate Northeast Republican is gone. It's not even a dying species. I think it's unfortunately in the grave right now. And many of them, remember, were the Abe Ribicoff and the Jacob Javits and the Arlen Specters, and that was a very strong strain in the sort of Jewish political firmament. And that whole part of the Republican Party doesn't exist anymore. And with it, the Jewish leadership. I mean, there was a Jewish, Republican leader in the House, Eric Cantor. He got swept away as well in this pull towards the right. So whether or not that will signal a growth in Jewish political power or a backlash, I don't know.
So this question is the 800-pound gorilla question, and I could make believe I never received it, but that would be really disingenuous. And needless to say, I'm going to ask you the question, Jonathan, and I'm going to ask you the question, Jane. And it goes as follows, and I'm not making it up. This question is in the description of this program, but it has not been addressed. So here's the question. What, if any, is the role of the Trump administration in the rise of anti-Semitism? Would you like to leave right now?
No, I would love to jump in. I mean, look, I don't hesitate to talk about this at all. Look, I like to quote Andrew Gillum, the still undetermined gubernatorial candidate, when he told his opponent Ron DeSantis, "I'm not saying you're a racist. I'm just saying the racists think you're a racist." I think I'm not going to say Donald Trump is an anti-Semite, but the anti-Semites believe he's an anti-Semite. And I will say I don't think that the rise of this kind of bigoted right-wing white nationalism came because of Trump. It was almost certainly in existence well before Donald Trump. But I do think that they see in the rise of President Trump and Trumpism encouragement. They believe that they have an ally in the White House, and they believe that signals that you may miss, they don't miss. I mean, remember the closing ad of the Trump 2016 campaign spoke of global special interests crashing down upon the poor American worker. And as they were talking about those global special interests, the Jewish faces of George Soros, Janet Yellen, and Lloyd Blankfein were crossing the screen. Mm-hmm. Now, you might not have noticed that, but David Duke noticed it, and Richard Spencer noticed it, and they are catching the signals. They are catching the signals. You know, there was another point. I always remember, go back in the campaign and think about all of these moments that took my breath away. You know, during the 2016 campaign, when I was just being bombarded by these images, a lot of them were of Pepe the Frog. Mm-hmm. Pepe the Frog was actually this kind of hipster cartoon character invented in California by actually kind of a hipster cartoonist who had no connection to the alt-right at all. But somehow the alt-right adopted this character, Pepe the Frog. And there was one moment after Hillary Clinton had talked about the deplorables that Donald Trump Jr. tweeted out an image of the deplorables, and it had pictures of basically all of the top campaign officials of the Trump campaign next to Pepe the Frog. And I thought, huh? Like, he didn't just come up with that. I mean, he didn't stumble into Pepe the Frog. He knew what he was doing. Mm-hmm. I mean, so you know, what can you say? And the signals have been out there so loudly that it's almost impossible to ignore all of them. Certainly, there has been a lot of trolling around. I mean, that image of Hillary Clinton over the Jewish star, they can say that it was a sheriff star all they want, but we know exactly where that came from. We know that somebody in the Trump campaign was trolling around the kind of 4chan, 8chan world looking for anti-Semitic imagery, and they found one. So who was it? I don't know. Dan Scavino says he did it, but he was innocent. I don't know. But look, there are, where there is smoke, there is fire.
Well, I think it's more than that. There was a white nationalist Nazi sympathizer in the White House. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Sebastian Gorka. I mean, my news organization broke a lot of these stories last year. This was a man who had ties to the virulent anti-Semitic far right in Hungary, and that's been, we documented it in numerous ways, and he had a very top position in the White House. Evidently, the president loved him, loved the way he appeared on TV, until it became untenable, and then he left. And now, he's, I guess, with Fox News and other places that are just in that orbit. Look, I think we have a complicated situation. I, for one, would not say Donald Trump's an anti-Semite. First of all, I don't know what's in his heart. Secondly, I know he loves his daughter. I know he loves his grandchildren. He has a Jewish daughter. He has a Jewish grandchildren. I don't think he hates Jews. He's surrounded by Jews. A lot of Jews are very important right now. But I think that we'd also be blind if we thought that somehow that inoculated him from the encouragement that he is given, overtly or indirectly, to these terrible forces that we're talking about. And sometimes in a much more direct way, like with Gorka. So I think he shares responsibility for this climate. It's not all because of him. It started before. If he left office tomorrow, it would continue. But, leaders, especially the leader of the free world, has a lot of power. Words matter. And the words that you use and the expressions that you give voice to and the permission that you give for this kind of language is your responsibility. And I think he doesn't understand that, and I think we're all the poorer for it.
This next question piggybacks very nicely on the preceding one. You mentioned, and again to both of you, you mentioned the protest against Trump in Pittsburgh. Do you feel that there's something peculiar about some of us protesting perhaps the most pro-Israel president since 1948, while we largely ignore smiling pictures of Mr. Obama with Farrakhan? I did not plant it. Okay?
No.
I did not.
I'm glad. I mean, look. First of all, I would distinguish. This is why I like to talk about bigotry and intolerance beyond anti-Semitism. I don't think that the Trump administration's policies toward Israel are really all that relevant to this discussion. There are geopolitical reasons why Donald Trump has embraced Netanyahu, why he wants to keep Israel close, and there are certainly political reasons because actually there are certainly voices in Israel that also feel that, look, the most important the number of evangelical Christians far exceed the number of Reform and conservative Jews in the United States. And there's an understanding in the Trump administration and in Jerusalem that if the Orthodox and the evangelicals are firmly on Likud's side, then how the Reformed and conservative Jews in this country feel about the policies of the Jerusalem government are not all that relevant. And I think that Donald Trump understands that too. So I don't really see U.S.-Israel relations as particularly relevant to a conversation about the swirl of bigotry and intolerance that is happening in the United States, but also happening globally. Remember, the alt-right actually likes Israel. The alt-right, not everyone, but many in kind of alt-right theology, Israel is an ethno-state. And they like ethno-states. They don't think that Jews are white, and they believe that all Jews should go to their ethno-state, Israel, and leave the United States to be the white ethno-state that they believe in, right? So it is not, to love Israel is not to necessarily love the Jews. It can be, but it isn't necessarily that way. And as far as, Farrakhan, first of all, Louis Farrakhan, Louis Farrakhan is a gutter anti-Semite. He is a bigot. His intolerance should be as decried as loudly as we would decry the hatred coming out of a David Duke or Richard Spencer, and it should not, no question. I don't really, the sight of Farrakhan at Aretha Franklin's funeral sitting next to Bill Clinton was deeply disturbing to me. And I don't understand why Bill Clinton just didn't get up. He might say, you know, hey, I didn't put myself here, but he also didn't make any moves to move. Now, I think that the idea, though, that this image of this, there was a picture of Barack Obama next to Farrakhan, no question. I'm the congressional editor at the New York Times. And when the Daily Caller, one of the conservative websites, started doing stories whipping up this idea that, that there was this cabal of Democrats aligned secretly or unsecret with Farrakhan, I actually took one of my most talented reporters, Nick Fandos, and I said, Nick, we can't ignore this. We have to go do a story about the Democrats and Farrakhan. And he went and he dug and he dug and he dug at all of the examples that the Daily Caller had said. And basically we came up with one guy, Danny, yeah, shoot, I forgot his last name. Anyway, backbencher from the south side of Chicago, who really did have kind of connections to Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. But all those other ones were just farcical. They were just fanciful. There's not, I mean, and you can believe it or not, but we couldn't find those connections. Now, the new Congress is going to have Rashida Tlaib, the first Palestinian American, as a Democrat from Detroit, and it will have Ilhan Omar, a Somali American who's also Muslim from Minnesota, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the conversation in the Democratic Party now. But I think that this notion of whataboutism, what about the anti-Semitism of Barack Obama, I just find farcical.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jane, I just want to clarify one thing with Jonathan. You find it farcical, but you're also saying, Jonathan, if I heard you correctly, that if you found yourself, or if a President Clinton finds himself sitting next to this man, they should make a statement.
Absolutely.
I believe I heard you say that.
Yes.
So you may find it farcical. On the other hand, it is also an opportunity, I think you're saying, or did say, to make a very, imagine that had happened.
Right.
That would have gotten a lot of attention. That would have drawn attention to the anti-Semitism that you're talking about in a way nothing else has for years about this particular individual.
It is all true.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I got him right.
No, that is correct. And you know, if I had a chance to ask Bill Clinton why the hell he was sitting next to Louis Farrakhan, I would love to ask him
I
that.
wanted to be sure I understood it. Jane.
We just have to, I agree with all your characterizations. We just have to remember, what power does Farrakhan have? Can he affect policy? Can he direct taxpayer dollars? I mean, you know, he's a despicable person. He should be shunned. He holds some rallies. And what else does he do? I mean, that's it. I'm not excusing him. I'm not saying he shouldn't be denounced. He should just be put in some kind of perspective. You know, he's not Sebastian Gorka, who was working in the White House. There's just a difference there. And I also want to just amplify the point that you made, Jonathan, about the evangelical Christians. You know, who knows what's in Donald Trump's mind and his heart? But let's take it at face value that he really did care about bringing the embassy to Jerusalem, that he really hated the Iran deal and felt that we should get out of it, that he really thinks that the money going to the Palestinian Authority is ill-used and we shouldn't do that. Those are all very, very legitimate points of view. But we also have to recognize where the real political power is coming from, and it is coming from the evangelicals. Go back to the moment he signed the order to move the embassy. I've looked at that video. I've looked at those frames. There was only one other person in the frame that they had, and that was Mike Pence. There were no Jews. There were no representatives of the government of Israel. There was a Christmas tree. It was December, but that was it. Who spoke at the embassy dedication? Evangelical Christians, one of whom has said such horrible things about Mormon that Mitt Romney denounced him. There were not even any Democrats invited to that ceremony. So I totally understand why my Israeli friends and the Israeli government feel so strongly that the moves that Trump has made affect Israel in a positive way. I don't agree, but I completely understand it's very, very legitimate. But we ought not to be seduced into thinking that this is just because he loves Israel and only loves Jews. No, it's catering to evangelical Christians. And we're seeing that all over the world now. We're seeing that in Guatemala, in Brazil. We're seeing the rise of domestic politics affecting the politics towards Israel.
So we're at around 9 o'clock. I'm going to ask one last question. Thank you, by the way, for some very good questions. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. But you guys are going to hang around for a while, so you can ask later. But I am going to end with one sort of global, cosmic question, and you better have some good answers for this. The global cosmic question, which is not so easy to answer: what American political leaders do you feel have the most positive voice for tolerance? And I would much prefer if you came up with some names that most of us in this room would recognize.
Political leaders.
Now, this is I mean, if we have to think
I
this
mean,
long about the answer,
we do have to think
that is
about
a statement in and of itself.
I think the statement is that it is strangely enough how little conversation we've had on this national level about this at the political level. I mean, I would say, you know, I probably get some hisses if I say this, but Jeff Flake has at least talked about civility and the notion the notion that we have got to like listen to each other. Now I know that a lot of people think that he's all talk, but at least he is doing the talk about this. And on the Democratic side, I mean, you know, I mean, I hate to say it, but and I'll probably get some hisses on this one too. But when it comes to trying to talk about the most vexing issues that divide us and efforts to unite us, we still look to Obama. I mean, we still look to Obama to be the president.
At least he didn't say Michelle, so that's good.
Yeah. Definitely look to Michelle. You know, I think I'm not in Washington, and so I'm not as tuned to the national political scene. And you know,
shucks, Jane.
No, I have some answers though. But you know, I was impressed with what happened in Arizona. You know, you had this incredibly close Senate race, and the Republican McSally conceded in such a generous, just in such a generous way. And Senator-elect Sinema accepted in such a generous way. Is it a coincidence that they're both women? I think not. But I think that that's an example of how it can be done. You know, I can be cynical and say that McSally was positioning herself to get the seat if Kyle doesn't want to run again, whatever. You know, you can always figure out these other motives, but you know, I think that is just one example of the way that it can be done. And I just want to add this, which is, I don't look just to political leaders for this. America has so many extraordinary Jewish leaders, so many extraordinary rabbis, so many people who are really, really doing the work on the ground and walking the walk. And I think we have to look to them for leadership and inspiration.
So thank you to both of you. No. You may not applaud yet, and you may not say another word. Not yet, because I want to end.
I want you to applaud.
I want to end not with my own words or any of our words, but with the words of our first president. These words were trotted out several times in the wake of Pittsburgh so I am not doing anything new, but they are worth reciting on this particular occasion. This is George Washington, his letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, a letter that is dated August 18th, 1790, and I am reading only a very small part of what anyway is a rather short letter. Happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Thank you to all of you.